That's just joined. For today's panel discussion, we're just going to give people a couple of minutes. I can see we've got people just jumping in from the waiting room now, so I'm assuming we'll have a couple more joining as we go. But look, what I might do is I might just kick off with a little bit of background before we get into the panel while a few others are joining. So yeah, today's session is on better forecasts using AI, and this is more a panel discussion format webinar. Will be just a few housekeeping things. There will be time for Q&A, so we'll be leaving plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the session. So if you've got questions as you go, punch them into the Q&A box, and we'll make sure that we get to answer them at the end. Depending on how many numbers we've got, we might also open it up so that people can directly ask the questions at the end as well. But if you punch them in the Q&A box as you go, that just helps capture all the questions that are coming up. We will record the session, so if you obviously don't want to be recorded, then make sure you've got your audio and video turned off and things like that. And let's keep the microphones muted while we're going through the main part of the discussion, and then, as I said, we can unmute the things at the end. Before we get into it, and while people are joining, I'll just give a little bit of background on Intellify. So we're a data analytics and machine learning company. I guess we've got a number of different areas we focus on. We help people in 3 different ways. Everything from strategic advisory, so where we're going and helping find opportunities for AI and machine learning in businesses, through consulting and execution, where we're either implementing solutions or partnering with existing data teams to deliver results in their department. And lastly, managed services, where we take an ongoing role helping manage and maintain some of the machine learning models. We're recognised by Amazon, so we're their data analytics and machine learning partner of the year last year, and we're one of only 3 in Australia to hold the Amazon machine learning competency. We work across a number of different areas, everything from time series forecasting, which is really going to be the focus of what we're talking today, through recommendation engines, computer vision applications, whether it's with satellite data or pictures or whatever. Right through to some of the marketing things around churn prediction or pricing optimization, customer segmentation. We have a whole raft of different outcomes we've delivered for our customers, and you'll get to hear today about some of the results that can be achieved with machine learning. So I just wanted to start with that, and a quick introduction to the panel. So myself, I'm a product and delivery lead with Intellify, and then we have Schein. So Schein is the CIO of Schein, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. He's been with Schein for over 10 years now. And for those who don't know, Schein is a dental distributor. So they distribute dental products to all of the dentists. They're the largest in Australia and also have quite a large global presence as well. And then we have Mudit Srivastav. So he's the head of advanced analytics at Origin Energy. And he's been there sort of working and running in that team for over 7 years now. And I'm sure most people are a bit more familiar with the sort of things Origin do. And lastly, Cairns. He's principal consultant at Intellify. And he's got a lot of experience doing a whole variety of different machine learning applications. And, he's had industry background across different industries, including a lot of time at Commonwealth Bank and working in financial services. So I guess what's exciting, we've assembled a good panel that's got a good breadth of different industry backgrounds, and also different roles, because we really wanted to hear that different perspective from from the IT side and from the business and sort of the data science perspectives as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and get into the panel. I guess for today's panel, there are kind of a few key areas that we wanted to explore. And as I said, if you've got questions and things, feel free to punch them in the Q&A chat and we'll make sure we get to those at the end. But I mean, the first area we wanted to understand was about AI forecasting and, is it better than traditional forecasting and what people's experience have been. Then we want to touch on trust and understand, those issues around how you build trust in your forecast with the business. And lastly, seeing as we've got such a great panel, we really want to understand those lessons learned. Like, what were the things that they've learned over their experience of implementing these real projects. So look, I think to start off, I guess maybe we start with, forecasting in general and kind of what are the changes that people have seen in forecasting over the last few years, like to understand how they've seen forecasting evolving. Maybe Mudit, do you want to jump in and talk through that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James, and hi, everyone. Thank you for making the time. I'd sort of say, even taking a step back from the forecasting and the AI itself, I'd say there've been kind of two kind of key changes in this industry in general over the last couple of years. Firstly, is there's been a significant push towards the cloud and towards data lakes. And from our personal experience at Origin, we sort of went through a fairly significant and I'd say transformational project a couple of years ago in standing up an AWS-based data lake. Now, the reason that's important is because that really helps unlock the potential of what a data science team, for example, can actually do and the value that it can actually add to the business. Because, let's face it, sort of the AI and the forecasting and the modeling comes at the tail end of the process, but it needs to be really standing on top of a really strong, a fundamental platform and data engineering function. So that's probably the first change, I'd say. And the second change, and this is more along business adoption and willingness of stakeholders, is I definitely feel, particularly in the last couple of years, there's been greater appetite among decision makers across organizations, certainly ours and many others that we've sort of seen, to start using forecasting and predictive modeling a lot more in making decisions. And more, we're now starting to see a push towards even kind of feeding some of these into developing kind of new products and offerings for customers.
Yeah, great. Okay. And what sort of things are you seeing when you say sort of developing new products and new offerings? Have you got any examples that you're able to share?
Well, actually, there is one that's fairly topical that I can share. At Origin, we've recently launched a new behavioral demand response product called Spike. And a lot of that, and that's effectively the whole idea behind that is customers are incentivized for reducing their electricity demand at particular times, and it's got a gamified approach and so on and so forth. And that's obviously all driven by kind of data and AI and forecasting.
Yeah, okay, great, interesting. Yeah, okay. And Cam, what's been you've obviously seen a lot of different projects across a lot of different companies. What's been your experience in terms of how you've seen machine learning applied to forecasting, how that's changed over the last few years?
Thanks, James. Good question. And yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for the time. Look, I'd say there's a few. I think Mudit made some great points, and I'd add a few extra ones more focused on maybe some of the technical considerations. So the first is definitely an increase in popularity and some of the sophistication around some of the forecasting techniques pushing into that machine learning space. Some of the algorithms around like deep learning that Amazon and Google have opened up, and even some of the Bayesian statistics packages. So Facebook has open sourced. It's relatively old at this point, but it's called Prophet. It was, I think, released back in 2015, but a very powerful time series modeling tool. And that move into that high sophistication algorithm space has sort of supported, I guess, a greater push into handling real world messy data, especially when you're talking about hierarchical retail data where you might have, some very sparse periods and then quite bursty sales behavior. This type of stuff has typically not had as much attention in the academic space as other time series forecasting techniques and approaches. But, there's an enormous value proposition there and pot of money for people who can, squeeze out an extra, fraction of a percentage of accuracy when you're talking about scaling to enormous retail or other organizations utilizing forecasts. So, that is definitely one trend. I'd say another big trend that I've definitely seen in the projects that I've been involved in delivering is actually more of a push or an interest in predicting not just the mean or point interval, but also building out or predicting an uncertainty range or confidence interval in your forecast estimates. And look, I actually think this is going to be a massive trend through business, over the next 10, 20 years. Uncertainty intervals are an enormous thing in science because you need to be able to, evaluate experimental results. And, a scientific paper that doesn't have uncertainty intervals is not very good, generally. But that in many cases is equally applicable when you're talking about a business context. Often in a business application, it's not just, well, what's the most likely or mean outcome in my time series forecast, but what are the upside risks and downside risks, and what's the spread in uncertainty on my particular forecast, and how can I use that to plan for different outcomes and contingency plans.
Yep. Okay, great. So we're starting to touch on, I guess, some of the improvements that are happening over time with machine learning forecasts. But I'm interested to understand sort of what that means in terms of outcomes for the business. Like, are they? So obviously, it sounds like the forecasts are doing a better job. But how's that translating into the business? So maybe Sean, I know in your case you're earlier on the journey, and we'll be spending a lot more time talking about how you're working to build trust with the business around forecast. But I guess what were the drivers for you in pursuing a machine learning based forecast, and how did you see that translating into the kind of business objectives and business results you want to achieve?
Yeah, thanks, James, and morning, everyone, or afternoon, I should say. So if I could answer that question probably in a couple of ways, and to add some further colour to the comments of Cam and Mudit, just in regards to machine learning and machine learning based forecasting and what interested us, and that the two sort of go hand in hand in regards to the outcome and what we're trying to where we're trying to get to. So in terms of what interested us was we're seeing and people are driving forecasts, starting to drive past in a non-traditional sense. So our typical forecast, or the typical forecast, is typically product and demand means an eventuation of an order in an ERP or some form of transactional system. That may be invoiced or it may be pure demand. But what interested us was what I would call non-traditional demand. And that non-traditional demand would be who's looking at the products online, looking at our EDMs, who's looking at electronic digital marketing messages, at what level are they being looked at? In a digital economy or in a digital environment or space, that to us is all demand. And traditional forecasting systems or platforms don't really take that into account. They're really, for the most part, looking at SKU, or the way we viewed it, they're for the most part looking at a traditional revenue to receipt type process where you're placing an order. You could either fulfill that or not, but that's either depending on how you reflected that in demand. You would, that would then register in your forecast system. With the machine learning platforms, we have the ability to incorporate other forms of demand that we see as becoming more and more important over time. So that's point one. In terms of the outcomes that we're trying to get to, it's really from a business perspective, we're trying to get a better hold of our own destiny in terms of really trying to understand ahead of the game. And this isn't rocket science or data science. It's really just, pardon the pun, it's really just trying to, us get ahead of where we need to be in terms of what our data is telling us. We're in a fortunate position in terms of the business has enormous amounts of data, enormous amounts of transactional data about our customers or from our customer history with us, and we want to leverage that to be ahead of the game in terms of where our stock position should be, what we should be thinking about in terms of budgeting, resourcing, and basically what we should be messaging to our supplier partners who are, a very, very important piece of our environment that we work in.
Yeah, okay, great. And so your audio was breaking up a little bit at the start, but I think you're explaining how you started with the demand forecasting and using the machine learning to do your demand forecasting, and how the other signals, I guess, around that might contribute to demand, how that's one of the key things. What was the sort of, I guess, the business outcomes you're looking for in terms of like what was the final business metrics you were looking to shift by having these better forecasts, Sean?
Yeah, so our ultimate goal is to reduce our working capital, or better manage our working capital within the business. So, you know, we're a distributor. Henry Schein's a distributor. We're not a manufacturer. We basically buy big boxes, sell little boxes. You know, inventory is our second largest working capital item within the business. We have big chunks of money tied up in working capital and management of our inventory. So our goal was, you know, to use that working capital more effectively. I'm not saying that we're bad at it, but we obviously want to always improve that, given it's such a big piece of the puzzle. And to also, the other real objective was to give the business a forward look on any potential stock provision problems. So stock provision, just in terms of a bit of definition, different people refer to it as different things, but potential future stock write-off because of slow moving, change of conditions, change of demand, whatever that may be. We have around 60,000 SKUs that we sell. You know, keeping a solid eye on 60,000 SKUs in terms of any potential provision problem can be challenging at times. And we wanted to let the, you know, platform and data science do the work for us and highlight those things before they became a problem, because unfortunately, once something appears on a provision report, you've missed the boat. It's already an issue. We want to get ahead of it and allow the business, or signal to the business, this could be a problem in 6 months' time or 3 months' time. You know, start thinking about how it's going to be addressed now, not thinking about it once it starts to actually gobble up some profit on the bottom line.
Okay, interesting. What's interesting there is I'm really picking up the same comments that Mudit was making around that there's now sort of other things that are being layered on top of the forecast and other applications is helping drive, so you're getting multiple uses out of it. So yeah, that's great. That's really interesting. And Mudit, have you got any information you can share around, I guess, how you've seen the results of some of the forecasting, like what that is translated to in terms of business impact?
Yeah, so I'd probably say we've been kind of using AI-driven forecasts for a variety of different processes now. The first one, which has been running for the longest time, about 6 years now, is our electricity demand forecast. So this is like a half-hourly time series forecast of electricity demand. It's primarily used by our energy trading team to better procure energy supply. That has probably been the most material, that we've realized the most material benefits out of that. So typically, I'll just kind of talk a little bit about the performance and then how that translates into perhaps a financial value. So we sort of always had a legacy demand forecasting system, and that had an accuracy, a MAPE of about 8%. Now, obviously, a MAPE out of context doesn't really mean anything, but this is just to highlight the relativities. Our kind of new AI-driven model, or new in quotations, it's now 6 years old, kind of was able to deliver a significantly more accurate forecast with a MAPE of about 3%. Now that 5% improvement in forecasting performance translates to roughly a, you know, ballpark sort of $10 million annualized benefit to our trading team. That's I've cherry picked the most successful examples. But kind of typically one of the areas we try and really focus on is to be able to quantify the benefit that we're able to add to the business, and we typically do it in this format to try and see what the benefit in a pure data science sense was, and then if that can be quantified into a dollar benefit.
Yeah, great. I mean, it's quite impressive, impressive results. And like I mean, you said that's your best example of the one that's been running the longest. So obviously you started with that low-hanging fruit, but in other forecasting models you've done, like, is there what do you often see in terms of you know, return for the business as a result of those models? Like, do you have a rough numbers around what results you could achieve?
Look, to be completely honest, I think it absolutely depends on the business application. And one of the things I will highlight is often you may try 5 or 6 different, you may have 5 or 6 different use cases, and one of them will be successful. And that's often what we see. We'll often try and tackle many different forecasting problems, and many of them won't really go anywhere. You'll probably put in a light investment and then see, no, that kind of isn't really delivering what we wanted to. And then you kind of quickly pivot from that and onto something else. Typically, what we would try and look for is some sort of benefit that we can quantify that the process is adding. Now, that could be a financial benefit. So when working with energy trading, that's easy to do because that's often something that can be quantified. Alternatively, it could be some sort of benefit from an improved customer experience, like a net position score uplift, reduced churn benefit, a variety of different things. So we don't always look for dollar benefits, but either a benefit for that's financial or reducing costs or improving customer experience or reducing churn.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Awesome. So, I mean, I think it's clear that they're obviously performing well, and there's, as you say, there's, they won't all work, but the ones that do work can work quite well. I guess the next part to move to is talking about trust, because I think it's whenever you talk about forecasting, how you build trust with the business so they actually trust the forecast is sort of a key thing that keeps coming up. Cam, I'm interested in your experience. Obviously, you work with a lot of customers, and like that would be one of the key things you have to work on building. How do you go about building trust with the business in the forecasts that you develop?
Absolutely, James. Yeah, look, whenever Intellify is brought into a project, it's almost always as a change function, and we all know changing away from the status quo can be very challenging, depending on the situation. So building trust is absolutely critical, especially when you're talking about a core process within the business, often owned by an individual or a team, and they're sort of used to doing something in a particular way. I've found that the best builders of trust in really any project, but let's take a forecasting project as an example, is, firstly, bring that end user along the journey, explain and benchmark how the model works, what the accuracy is, how it's doing, how you interpret accuracy metrics, and ideally compare any new model or any new forecasting tool or technique against what an existing process is. And you can do all of that in a fairly quick and light way in a prototype phase, as Mudit, I think, was alluding to. You can actually, with a pretty light investment, get a good ballpark idea of possible benefits from a forecasting project in this space. Then we talk about moving into production, and really production there, you're trying to take those same transparency and benchmarking ideas and concepts and bring them into a live environment. So having the ability to quickly and easily track the model forecast performance, through the days and weeks and months that model becomes live. And I'm a big believer that trust comes from seeing something work, and once you see it work and you're seeing the benefits and just the accuracy that I guess you benchmarked in the prototyping and test phase of ML AI statistical project, move into the actual on the ground, impacting business processes. That is absolutely the easiest way and fastest way to build trust with people in an organization.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And Mudit, I imagine you would have gone through this. Like, what was your experience on? I mean, maybe take us back to that the first application you're talking about. Like, do you want to take us through how you went about? What was the journey like for actually building trust with the business in that case?
Yeah, look, I'd actually echo largely everything that Cam just mentioned. So it was a lot of kind of very similar things. So it was kind of a key challenge for us was bringing the stakeholders along on the journey, and also the issue of explainability, because that's often a big trade-off, and kind of especially if you're looking at a deep learning model, for example, the issue of modeling complexity, which may give you a better forecast, versus explainability to an end stakeholder who often has to make a judgment call based on the forecast and make a decision based on them. So that we invested a significant amount of effort in making sure we could intuitively explain some of the key drivers of our forecast. So for example, if, it would be no surprise that weather would be an input into our electricity demand forecast. So for example, even being able to give stakeholders a rough kind of guide saying, look, if the temperature is going to be 2 degrees hotter, you can expect the demand to be X megawatts higher. Even something as simple as that, just providing kind of simple intuition around the model, I think went a really long way. And then moving on to kind of when the model was actually in production and then deployed, again, sort of along the lines of what Cam mentioned, doing a lot of sort of back testing. So kind of performing, saying, this is what we predicted, this is what the actuals came in, these were the differences, this is why, and then iteratively working with our stakeholders and kind of incorporating their feedback and their subject matter expertise into our models kind of made a significant difference.
The point that Mudit made there around model explainability and interpretability is a fantastic one as well. Like, again, this is not unique to forecasting problem, but just generally, how do you build trust in an algorithm? You know, like especially as you get into the more sophisticated ML algorithmic space. And there's some, you know, there's been a huge amount of active development on ML interpretability, all of which applies quite nicely to many of the time series models that Intellify builds, and I think the other guys on the call are also utilizing, and actually being able to show in that intuitive way with visualizations and you know, input-output analysis. You know, yes, this actually does make sense, and I can understand and begin to trust it is a key step there.
Yeah, right. So it sounds like bringing the business along the journey as you're going through the iterations of developing the model and involving them in the process is really important. I mean, Mudit, how did you know? Like, how did you know when you hit that point where you go, actually, now the business has got enough trust in this forecast that we've built that we're ready to kind of move to the next stage?
I actually remember the specific moment where I thought this. I'll share a bit of a story. You know, we're all friends here. So, you know, like in most organizations, we have, there's these monthly forums, which are fairly sort of serious, where various aspects of risk and performance are kind of discussed. And we have a standing agenda item at one of these where we basically present forecasting performance. We say, this is how all our models sort of went. And I remember when we first started, we'd have about, let's say, 20 to 30 minutes on the agenda of this 1 hour meeting to talk about how our forecasts were doing, and we get scrutinized in every kind of half hour and every kind of movement. And then as the business started building more trust, the amount of time on the agenda that I used to get kind of started to shrink. And then at one point, it was a meeting. This is 2 years into the journey, so mind you, it took quite a while. I think the meeting was just running a bit short on time, and the chair of the meeting, who's kind of the most senior person there, sort of said, "Oh, look, I mean, I think we can probably skip over the forecasting section because that's all under control." And at that moment, I sort of said, yes, finally. Because with forecasting, often no news is good news. So that was kind of the moment where I thought, yes, we were kind of getting some trust with the stakeholders.
Sounds good. Yeah. And Schein, you're earlier in the journey, and you're very much in that trust building phase right now. So do you want us to talk us through, I guess, again, coming from that IT perspective, working with the business, how you're going about building trust in the forecast that's just been developed?
Yeah, not dissimilar to what Mudit has described. We will typically, there's probably one, and if I can add probably something to what Cam articulated as well, along with, you know, trying to deliver a result, we'll often try and deliver an insight, as in something that the business can't or doesn't have today, or something that's extremely difficult for them to do, or is extremely labour intensive. If we can, you know, present something like that as an output, that really drives a lot of interest in the business and gets quite a bit of traction. So that's typically a hook that we'll look for in terms of getting engagement. You know, the learnings for us have really been, and this applies to any project, if there's no engagement from the key stakeholders, you're really wasting your time. But the other thing I would say, and you know, interested to hear what Mudit and Cam's thoughts are on this, you know, where Henry Schein is quite an autonomous company and offer, you know, different, have a range of different systems across the world. You know, we're quite fortunate in that we have a quite, what I would call simple setup here, in that we have one single system of record or source of truth, where all of our financial demand data sits. For other Henry Schein environments, that's not the case. But where I'm sort of going to is a couple of key things were really being able to access your data and understanding your data. So, and then being able to offer the business, as I said, some insight that they're not getting today. And in terms of the subject matter experts that Mudit touched on, they need to be trusted within the business as well. If you want influence within the business, you need to have someone in those teams that is trusted and knows their stuff, and they really need to know their data. And going back to the point I alluded to earlier, just about our environment and system here locally, other Henry Schein entities have gone through this process where they've had to spend enormous amounts of time and effort, basically aggregating their data into a source, into a single data lake first. And we've done something similar, but it was far easier for us to do than perhaps some of our cousins overseas. So they've had a two-step journey where they've had to basically have someone validate the data first and then validate what the forecast is doing. But it needs to be someone that really understands that data and has influence and really understands the permeations of the data and, what looks ridiculous and what looks right. So we went through a series of back tests similar to what, Mudit described. But there are a bunch of different variables that impact the output of that, and the people that you've got engaged need to be able to identify those. So a really good example is we have contract buys for some of our suppliers. The contract buys make the forecast look stupid, but we're committed to those buys. Now, unless you're aware of the business nuances, and it shouldn't be just the data, it should be the business nuances. Unless you're aware of those nuances, if I just put an analyst in the room and they looked at those numbers, they would say, oh, this forecast crap, doesn't make any sense. We need to go back to the data. Whereas in reality, it does make sense, but there's a business reason for it. So I'd say probably a few things. It needs to be people that understand the data. They need to be able to influence, and they need to understand some of the nuances of the business that can impact the output, and be able to articulate those to others. And just in terms of touching on, explaining the models, we have it's a difficult thing to do, to explain to business people and, in terms of the models and how they work. We just try to, anything that's, a deep neural network, we basically just don't even try to touch it. We just try to touch on what the variables are that impact the output, and then demonstrate some form of value add or runs on the board moving forward.
Yeah, great. Okay. Sounds like a lot of common themes there in terms of building trust. So I hope that was helpful for the audience. Actually, we've got a question from the audience that I might jump to now. And for anyone else who's got questions, feel free to punch them into the chat, and we'll make sure we get through those. So the first question is, how often do you reforecast? And then how often is that new forecast available to be used in the secondary ways you described?
So for us, we reforecast once a week, but we're typically looking at, so the majority, and again, just to give a bit of a context around the data, the majority of our products come from overseas, are sourced overseas. We have an average lead time of around 6 weeks. So we're looking at, typically, we're interested in a 4 to 6 week horizon and a 26-week horizon. The 4 to 6 week horizon we're interested in is just to see whether we're going to run out of stock, or start to look at if we've got overstocks, and what our ordering position is in terms of open orders with suppliers. And the 26-week horizon is really around trying to identify problem items. So as I said, we're generating those forecasts every week with a focus on looking at those particular points in time.
Great. And Mudit, yourself?
I think I'd probably say it depends on the application itself. So for example, the forecast that we produce for energy trading, that's required to trade on a half-hourly energy market. And those forecasts, we reforecast every 30 minutes for that purpose. There's other forecasts that we may run, even demand forecasts that, as Sean mentioned, that are used for different time horizons. So those are used more for planning and budgeting purposes. And those we do once a day. There's yet other forecasts which are used for completely different purposes, which we might reforecast once a week. So I'd probably say that the answer to that question depends on the specific business application.
Yeah, okay, interesting. And I heard the same thing from Sean. It's about tying it to the business issue you're trying to solve is what helps dictate the the frequency that you need to rerun your forecasts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. And the second part of that question was, do you track and record the changes in the forecast?
We do. Yeah, we record the results of every forecast inference. So I wouldn't necessarily say we're comparing the differences between the forecasts, but we're certainly looking at differences between what the forecast tells us and what our actuals were.
Yep. Okay, and Mudit, yourself?
I'd say exactly the same thing, actually. So we do for kind of, we do record every single forecast we generate along with the inputs that we use to generate it. We do sometimes look at movements between forecasts depending on what specific kind of bit of analysis we're doing, but the vast majority of the analysis is around trying to do variance analysis between what the forecast said and what the actuals came in at, and in particular, what the drivers for movements between them were.
Yep. Yeah, perfect. Sounds good. I know at Intellify we have tools we use to help measure that and track that performance and the variation between the forecasts and the performance and deliver that as part of our projects. Yeah, great. All right. Well, look, thanks for that question. And once again, to everyone in the audience, feel free to punch in more questions. I guess I want to revisit some other questions with the panel. So, you know, how hard did you find it to roll out an AI forecast?
For us, this goes to, and Cam, sorry for jumping in, but probably for us, the majority of the work was in two areas. Was the data engineering, as Mudit touched on earlier. Again, a lot easier for us than potentially some of our cousins because of the reasons I elaborated on earlier. But still some work to make sure that we had the appropriate data elements and we had enough history. Certainly, you know, history in terms of data is an enormous lever in terms of output, particularly as it relates to forecast. And we played with that quite a bit to try and get to what we thought was appropriate. And basically what it distilled down to was, for us, was the more history we threw at the model, the better the results we got. And then the other thing that was challenging, not challenging for us, but interesting or opportunistic, as people would say, is how do you acceptance test forecasts? You know, how do you, you know, it's all very well to look at an output and compare it, but when you're trying to make a prediction and compare it to, what are you actually comparing it to? So we spend a lot of time working through that process. And again, similar to what Mudit described, we generated a series or a forecast series, a backtest forecast series against actuals for a period last year. And then now what we're doing now is basically doing the same, but forward look against actuals. So we expect to be in this sanity checking phase for a little while yet, until we get some comfort in the numbers moving forward. And COVID has impacted that, I have to say. So we've seen our business went into effectively almost a 10% of trade, 10% of normal trade in April. And that impacted the output of the forecast quite significantly. And we're looking at how that's impacted the output of the forecast now. But it's certainly understanding how to interpret and make sure and sanity check those predictive numbers is something that has been interesting for us, and something that we spent sort of quite a bit of time kicking around as to how best to do that.
I think those are some good points. You know, from my side, I think, you know, Intellify at this point in the year has delivered 7 or 8 time series forecasting projects, and I'd say, you know, at the moment, this is a known deployment pattern. So it's to actually build, develop, and deploy in a cloud-based, you know, well-architected infrastructure. It's a known problem, particularly for some of the, you know, really well-known time series forecasting problems like retail and inventory demand forecasting, like electricity or gas or water use forecasting. I'd say the trickiest bit, and the bit that any of the projects that I'm involved in, where definitely the most sort of bespoke planning and involved planning and investigation go in, is one on the data. And I think both Mudit and Schein have made really good points that every business's data is a bit different. There's different nuances, there's different conventions, there's different business processes and data entry issues that you need to be aware of when you're building out any model, but particularly a forecasting model. And the second one is around integration into an application or an existing work process. Where is the output of a forecast model actually going to hit the organization and be used to impact operations? And that isn't something that you should be kind of deciding at the end of a project. That's like a key consideration up front, and understanding, well, how we can use it. And some use cases it's very obvious, and other use cases, especially those which involve a person actually taking a forecast and data and then using that to make a decision, can be more challenging, and you just need to be able to plan and work towards that.
Yeah, great. And Cam, while you're talking, what are some of the different areas you've seen people apply machine learning forecasts in the companies you consult with?
Yeah, yes. So huge range. Like I'll just rattle off a few, even just this year. So we do a fair bit in the retail space, both digital retail and bricks and mortar retail, where a range of projects around inventory forecasting and being able to optimize product across different physical locations and different warehouses. Moving to Mudit definitely could speak to this, but we've done a couple of projects now in the electricity and gas demand forecasting space for a range of different sort of operators. Moving to FSI, which is sort of close to my heart, there's we've done a couple of different forecasting projects in the insurance space. One of the publicly referenceable ones that I can actually talk to is a claims forecasting project that we did with NIB, a large health insurer, where we actually built what turned out to be a time series forecast problem, but at the time the actuarial methods and thoughts treated it in a bit of a different way, and we ended up developing a claims forecasting, an outstanding claims forecasting model and output that substantially reduced the error compared to that those standard actuarial techniques. And if you think about actuaries and insurance, you have a whole team almost spending a significant proportion of their time predicting claims, and then those claims forecasts go into all sorts of things, into pricing, into the financial statements to the to investors, into things like operational and strategic decisions. And so if you can if you can make a change in accuracy to that massive driver of the business, it can have enormous flow-on effects. And probably a couple of other ones just to close that out. We're even doing a forecasting project at the moment around weather, which is a lot of fun, and some stuff around staff requirements for things like call centers or outsourcing organizations.
Yeah, cool.
Excellent. So there's a very varied selection of use cases there. And normally I find most businesses will have at least a couple of, pretty key drivers of value that are actually, forecasting problems.
Yeah, perfect. Sounds good. All right. We're getting a few questions coming through on the chat, which is excellent. I'll just give everyone a chance to think if they've got any other questions they want to punch in. One of the questions coming up is around, is more related to sort of how do you get started and what to do. So look, I might just interject with sort of a really quick summary of what we can do, and then we'll go back to the rest of the Q&A. So look, there's a couple of ways Intellify can help. So the first is we can run a complimentary discovery workshop. So this is where we come in and we sit down and look at your business and really understand where either forecasting or machine learning in general can be applied to really generate some measurable ROI across your business. So that's sort of one area, and that's a complimentary process. But the other thing we can do, if you really want to, I guess, get into the data and see how good these forecasts can actually perform, we can run something called a proof of value. So it's usually about a $12,500 project where we come in and we actually run some forecasts. We look at the I guess the different areas of your business where you could apply forecasting. I can say I've said personalization there, but we do this both across personalization and forecasting. And we actually run tools on your data, and then we do some of the measurement the guys were talking around to sort of measure the performance. So look, if you're doing it on AWS, we're actually the launch partner for Amazon Forecast in Australia. So in that case, the project can be co-funded, and for $5,000 we can run this proof of value engagement. So yeah, a couple of options there for how to get started. But if I jump back to some of the other questions coming up from the group, first one, there's a trade-off between explainability of models, particularly when using deep learning networks that can model much more complex data trends. And there's the more complex the model, the harder it is to explain. But typically, it's also higher accuracy because it can model those complex trends. So, when you're thinking about building trust with the business, for your stakeholders, what takes preference? Do they prefer like a better model that's more accurate, or do they prefer a model that's maybe not as accurate but is explainable? Or maybe Mudit, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, firstly, that's an outstanding question, and it's probably one of the biggest considerations in implementing any forecasting project. I think once again, it sort of comes down to both what the actual objective is and also the stakeholders themselves and the preferences of stakeholders, because every kind of stakeholder will be slightly different in this sense. And another thing I'll probably say is something that really helps, in addition to having kind of complex models versus explainability, is what Cam actually touched on earlier in the meeting, and that's around having things like confidence intervals and basically having uncertainty bounds around the forecast. So one of the things that we implemented was we were willing to trade off some, and this was a few years ago, we were willing to trade off some complexity in our forecasting models and accept that would give us perhaps a lower forecasting accuracy. So even if the MAPE was sort of 0.2% less than what we'd be able to get with a more sophisticated model, we accepted that trade-off in discussion with our stakeholders. But in addition, sort of added uncertainty bounds, saying, well, on these days, and this is where a combination of having uncertainty plus intuition is really powerful, because if we're able to go up to our stakeholders and say things like, this is a P99 type of day. We've had very few data points around this time, which the model can be trained on. And typically the uncertainty around our forecast with data like this is X. Then that enables the stakeholders to make some fairly informed decisions about how to actually use the forecast. Now, I will say in the last couple of years, and this is something actually Intellify introduced to us, we've been using kind of SHAP a lot more, kind of the SHAP package. And this is actually kind of really kind of bringing these two factors to almost to kind of bringing these to converge, where we're now being able to develop more and more sophisticated models, but there's actually packages that help us explain these better.
Yeah, great. Yeah. And Sean, what's your experience been in regards to sort of explaining it, explainability with the business?
It's all about the results, James.
Yeah.
Our business and our stakeholders are somewhat interested in the explainability, probably more interested in the inputs rather than how the model works itself. But the keenest interest is in the results and the output every time.
Yeah. Yeah, great. And what tools do you use to actually, I guess, help the business compare the results that are being generated with what was actually happening? How do you do that with your business?
Yeah, we push the output into our BI tool and then incorporate or overlay actuals against it. So the business has a very familiar way, I guess, or a very familiar mechanism that a whole bunch of people in the business, either directly involved stakeholders or not, have access to, in terms of being able to then interrogate the data and see what the results are.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So
it's very, very easily visible as well.
Yeah. Yeah, great. So it's a tool they're already comfortable with that they can use to compare against.
Yeah, correct.
Great. And the next question we've got, this one's a question for Mudit. How long does it take to implement each forecast analysis, e.g. the one running every 30 minutes, and what's the size of your data?
So if I understand the question correctly, was it how long it kind of took to develop the actual process?
I think the question might be how, if I understand it properly, it's how long does it take to train? Like, you know, if you're making a prediction every 30 minutes, how long does it take to update and retrain your model with the new time step?
Yeah, got it. That's a great question. So I think once again, in the case of that model that needs to run every 30 minutes, this was a key consideration. And this again goes back to that complexity versus how the model runs. This particular model runs in about 1.5 minutes, and that's basically retrain and reforecast. Now there's other kind of retail facing models that we have that often take sort of an hour to retrain, and we may kind of retrain them once a quarter and then rescore them once a week, for example. So in those use cases. So once again, how often the model actually needs to reforecast or rescore is probably a key design decision that goes into actually selecting the algorithms and developing the logic.
I'd agree with that as well. You know, I've had a range of different use cases, and it, you know, that operational question of what frequency do you need to retrain your model versus, you know, how large a compute instance you want to spin up, and the cost associated with that, versus yeah, how long and how complex is the algorithm to retrain, are all just part of the, you know, the trade-offs that exist in this type of space.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Look, if you've got any more questions, feel free to punch them in. But I think, I guess I'm interested in closing thoughts from each of the panelists. Like, what's the biggest pieces of advice that you could give the audience in terms of if they're about to embark on their first, you know, forecasting project? What are the biggest piece of advice that you'd offer? So maybe just go around and start with Cam.
Yeah, sure, James. Look, I'd say the couple of bits of advice. One is normally I haven't seen an organization that there isn't like a pretty big opportunity there in terms of forecasting. I find most orgs are using or could use forecasts in some capacity, and often they're in a really nice value driving role, as in, you know, the value, you know, those forecasts get consumed by parties downstream, and then the benefits sort of flow through. You know, the other bit, you know, advice is it's actually pretty easy to prototype one of these. Prototype one of these models, get a ballpark understanding of, you know, what benefits you might be able to get out of an updated forecast model, without having to go to like a full-blown productionization discussion. You know, and I think that sort of goes a little bit to the slide that you just talked to 10 minutes ago, James. You know, these proof of concept in a box, or, you know, 7-day sprint to get an estimate of value are definitely things that most orgs should be able to spin up.
Okay, great. And Mudit, what's your best piece of advice you could offer other people?
I would probably say another kind of something to look out for is once models have actually been developed and implemented and the business has trust in the models, the job probably isn't done. And what I mean by that is it's fairly easy for any forecasting model or any data science model, obviously, to go stale. And in fact, there's particular applications, for example, in some of the, maybe not a forecasting algorithm, but looking at propensity models and you know, things like that in the retail space. If you're using the model correctly, by definition, it's going to break. And what I mean by that is if there's a particular cohort of customers that might be, you know, suitable for a particular product, and then you start using the model to offer that to those customers, by definition, we're changing the actual behavior of the population, which means that the model will no longer be predictive as it once was. So I suppose the key piece of advice or insight here would be model monitoring and regular kind of refreshes and retraining is very important, because that trust that's built up can very easily be lost as well.
And Sean, your thoughts?
Yeah, if I could add to Mudit's sentiments there as well, I think that's really important, and really important message to the business stakeholders, that it's not a set and forget exercise. So we had some interesting, when we were doing the due diligence on some of this a little while ago, we had some interesting discussions with Amazon Retail about how they treat their forecasting models, and they retrain every year. And basically, what they do is run their new model and old model in parallel and compare the results. But that is an annual process for them, based on the fact that things are changing all the time. So they really do need to keep a finger on the pulse. But just back to your original question, James, I think a couple of things, if just more from a business sort of and also preparation perspective, if you're going to start down this path, make sure you've got something that the business is going to really attribute. There's real attributable value for the stakeholders that you're trying to engage with. It's again preaching to the converted in terms of probably everybody on the call, but if there's no attributable value, it'd be really difficult to get the ball rolling. Once you've identified what that is, make sure that the data is there to support it as well. If you've got, if you think it's a great idea and then start the process, but then find underneath, there's actually 6 different subsystems that, have a mess of data underneath that is you're going to need to go through a data normalization process before you can deliver anything. You need to understand and get a sense of what that looks like before you really push the button, or before you get too far along the stakeholder engagement journey. And I guess once you've gone through those checkpoints, then it's really around identifying, working with the, upstream stakeholders to really sell the value proposition and get support and engagement for the delivery.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Well, look, thank you so much to our panelists. I think everyone would agree there's been some fantastic insights, and I can see the comments that have been flowing through saying thank you for the insight. So I think that's your virtual round of applause for today. Sean, we do have a hamper that we'll just a thank you hamper we'll send out after this, just to say thanks for your time. But yeah, look, once again, thank you for joining us today. I hope everyone learned something, and as we said, feel free to get in touch if you want to explore either the discovery workshop or explore a proof of value engagement. We're happy to talk through around how we can make forecasting really work for your business as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Cheers.
Really
Thank you. Bye, everyone. See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.